I'm Stefan Kent, Chief Curator at the Hirshhorn, and it is my privilege today to welcome you to this week's installment of Talking to Our Time with artists A. Bronson and Adrian Stimson, who will be in conversation with curator Betsy Johnson. So welcome A. and Adrian, it's great to have you here. As we were discussing, I had the great chance to see your installation at the Toronto Biennial in 2019. One of the most compelling and powerful works I've seen in years, and I'm sure you'll have much to say about it in the coming hour. As you all know, guests and audience, our galleries are still closed. We did open the garden recently with two new works by Huma Baba and Sterling Ruby. But the galleries are closed, but we exist online, and every week we bring you a conversation with different artists, and we believe that hearing the artists and having their voice out is still the most important thing that we can do. You can tune in to Hirshhorn Inside Out and subscribe to our the Hirshhorn website, and you will receive the newsletter and be in the knowledge of everything that we are doing. I want to thank the Embassy of Canada for their support with today's program. Both Adrian and AA are Canadian, as you may know. And before we begin, I gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose lands, ancestral homelands, we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. Now, please enjoy today's discussion with A. Bronson and Adrian Stimson with Betsy Johnson. And on behalf of the Hirshhorn's entire team, I welcome you and I wish you good health.
Hello, my name's Betsy Johnson, and I am so pleased to have A. Bronson and Adrian Stimson with me here today to discuss a project that they embarked upon several years ago to address the traumatic history of the residential school system in Canada. Both artists have an ancestral connection to this history through their great-grandfathers who are on opposing sides of the conflict around a rebellion that happened at the Old Sun Residential School in 1895. Bronson's great-grandfather was Reverend John W. Timms, who was the first missionary at the Siksika Nation and the founder of the Old Sun Residential School in 1883. Adrian Stimson's great-grandfather was Old Sun, a legendary Siksika chief and medicine man whom the school was named after. Several years ago, AA asked Adrian if he would facilitate an apology to the Siksika Nation for AA on behalf of his ancestors, and that is where their collaboration began. So I want to give a quick introduction to both of the artists, and then we're going to discuss this project. A. Bronson is based in Berlin. Today, he is an artist, curator, educator, and healer. He founded a free school, commune, and underground newspaper in the 1960s before he co-founded General Idea, which was a Toronto-based art collective co-founded with Felix Parts and Jorge Zontal that was active for 25 years from 1969 to 1994. General Idea was known for its projects that celebrate otherness. They did beauty pageants and TV talk shows. They also did many ephemeral publications and installations. They're very well known for the works that addressed the AIDS crisis as it unfolded, specifically from the years of 1987 to 1994. After the deaths of Parts and Zontal in 1994, Bronson incorporated healing into his practice. He practiced as a healer for many years. He did a series called The Invocation of the Queer Spirits from 2008 to 2010, and he later founded A. Bronson School for Young Shamans. He's also founded the Institute for Art, Religion, and Social Justice at the Union Theological Seminary. And he's been a publisher throughout his life, publishing File Magazine for 18 years with General Idea, and also as the director of Printed Matter in New York, and the founder of the New York Art Book Fair and the LA Art Book Fair. Adrian Stimson is based in southern Alberta, Canada, a member of the Siksika Nation. He's an interdisciplinary artist, and his work addresses themes of genocide and resilience that stem from his personal experience attending residential schools. His performances speak to the hybridization of Indian, cowboy, shaman, and two-spirit being. Two of his recurring personas are Buffalo Boy and Shaman Exterminator. His work has been acquired recently, rather recently, by the British Museum for their North American Indigenous collection, and he has had many awards, including the Blackfoot Visual Arts Award in 2009, the Reveal Indigenous Arts Award in 2017, and the Governor General Award for Visual and Media Arts in 2017 as well. So I am hoping that Adrian and AA are here and will join us now and to speak about this project. Hello.
Hello, thank you.
So we're all tuning in from different parts of the globe. AA from Berlin, where it's now 8 p.m. Adrian from southern Alberta, where it's noon. And I'm here in Virginia, where it's 2. I'm so glad that we could all come together to discuss this project that was first really realized at the Toronto Biennial in 2019 and is an ongoing project. And I wanted to start maybe with by reading the first line of the introduction of your book. It says, "I have been hurtling towards this project for the last 7 decades." And I think that the one thing that really strikes me about this public apology that project that you've been doing is that it's something that you've been working towards your whole life, and it's something almost that the way you speak about it, almost like you were destined to arrive at this point and to do this project. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you came here.
I hardly know where to start. I could talk for the whole hour just about that, but I won't. So many good stories. But my great-grandfather came to North America in 1883 as the first missionary to Siksika Nation. It was just after the time of Treaty 7, when a lot of the reserves were set up. And I'm not going to tell his story right now, but my grandfather was born on that reserve just the year of the uprising when they had to flee. My grandfather became the head of another residential school and on another reserve. My father was born on that reserve and ran away when he was 14. I think because of the level of abuse on the reserve, I've never ever heard him talk about it, about his childhood. His childhood was just silence. And he ended up in the Air Force and then retired to the Okanagan Valley where he had an apple farm, and he would only hire Indigenous families, and he would treat them what was considered very well. He gave them a house with hot water and proper toilet and everything. He would pay them in cash every Friday. He would give the cash to the mother because he was very proud of his knowledge of the Indigenous family. So he would give the cash to the mother, and the mother would peel a bit off and give it to the father, who would then go downtown and get drunk and get thrown in prison. And then the next morning, my father would turn up with no arrangements having been made and bail him out of prison and take him back to the farm. So he was kind of like the good colonial. I mean, he was really he really thought he was a different kind of white man, by doing that. But in the end, it's the same colonial story. It's just a different version of it. And when I was 7, stop me if I go on for too long, you know, because I'm an old guy, so I tend to wander. When I was 7, I stopped going to church. We used to go to church every Sunday, and I always went to Sunday school. And when I was 7, the Sunday school teacher changed. And instead of somebody who was really giving us a proper religious education, we had a missionary couple from Africa, I mean, white missionary couple, who had spent their time in Africa, who would turn out the lights and show us slides of starving African children, and that was became our religious education. And I stamped my little foot and said, I'm not doing this. And I left the church at that point, and I never looked back. Like I found from then on, I found Christian churches creepy. I couldn't go into them for decades. And I started exploring all different kinds of religions, and especially indigenous religions, and but also Eastern religions. I got very involved for a number of years with the Tibetans, the Tibetan Buddhists, and through all of that, you know, my attention kept coming back to my great-grandfather and to the Siksika Nation and to the indigenous religion, and I started to research it. In the 70s, I went to the Glenbow Museum in Calgary and looked at my great-grandfather's papers and so on, trying to thinking there's something here I should be doing, you know, there's something here I should be doing, but I didn't know what. And the curator there tried to convince me I should write a biography of my great-grandfather, but somehow that felt like I would be sidestepping something by doing that. And I didn't do it in the end. And the decades kept going by. And I think the actual, where it all crystallized was with a grant. So the Canada Council, for the 150th anniversary of Canada, brought in a granting. I'm trying to remember the name of the grant now. What is it? Maybe Adrian can help me. New Chapter. So there's a grant called New Chapter for projects that address the history of Canada. And it all kind of everything just in my head fell into place. That what this story was a story of the history of Canada. Especially, and I haven't told you what the story was, but it rotates around this 10-year period of my great-grandfather at Siksika Nation, building the first residential school, taking the children away from their parents, putting them into British clothing, only allowing them to speak English, not allowing them to leave the school for their holidays, so on and so forth. It was a kind of brutal regime, and it came to a head eventually when the kids started to die of white man's diseases, and rather than handing the kids over to their own healers or to their own parents, my great-grandfather insisted they had to stay in the school, because if they left the school, he was afraid if they died, their souls would go to hell. So they had to die in the school so that they could go into heaven. Just such a bizarre notion. And of course, the parents were just like, what is going on here? Why can't we have our kids? You know, they're dying. And everything erupted from there. So that's my grandfather fled. The school was burned down, the church was burned down, and then, and that's the family story, you know, but when you go into the kind of more public archives, for example, of the Anglican Church, there's no mention of an uprising, there's no mention of a church burning down. It's just that he was transferred to another tribe. And so part of this trip was to try and figure out what the truth was, or what the real story was. And with the help of the phenomenal assistant, Ben Miller, who did a lot of research on this and traveled with me, we were able to dig through both the archive in Calgary and the archive in Ottawa, and piece together what's really a story of genocide. a bit muddled, excuse me, but.
No, I think that's great. And that touches on a lot of points that I think are really crucial to this project. One being the problem of history and sorting out the truth. Who's telling the history? How is it told? What kind of information's been withheld? Even within your family history, you were told stories that your family was kind of building their lineage upon, their legacy upon, and it took you kind of going into the archives, hiring a research assistant, really kind of digging deep to really understand the full extent of what your ancestors were involved in and their part of this. And I think, I think there's something to be said, or there's a lot to be said about truth being kind of the uncovering the truth and uncovering the real history and laying it bare being such a large part of what is the work that's needed to be done to move forward. Adrian, I think, what's interesting to me is that you similarly kind of are involved in a like uncovering of the legacy of your ancestors and what happened at the same historical moment and unpacking it through your practice. And even before you met AA, a large part of your practice had to do with the Old Sun Residential School and archival materials that you found kind of documenting that school. And I've seen images that you used in early performance works that have A's great-grandfather in them, right? And so it almost seems like you two were destined to come together to work in this way. You're kind of moving along your separate paths towards one another. But I'm interested in kind of hearing a little bit about your understanding of this family history before this project began.
Absolutely. Thank you, Betsy, and thank you to Hirshhorn for inviting me to be part of this program. Yes, you had to wonder that there's a lot of mystical things at work here. And I think for me, a lot of my work, of course, deals with the history of genocide, and specifically my own familial history with Old Sun Residential School. As you know, my great-grandfather was Old Sun, and Old Sun, his name was used for that institution. Ironic in the sense that that institution was meant to destroy his descendants. So a lot of my work that I started around this started in the early 2000s when I started to examine my family history with Old Sun. And my father in particularly, who went to that school as well. So it was really sort of going to the Glenbow archive and also researching as well. But without, the knowledge of the relationship of the Reverend Timms to AA, there were two photographs in particular that I used as part of a photographic sort of juxtaposition with my alter ego Buffalo Boy, sort of talking back to that history. And one was Onward Upward, where Buffalo Boy dressed as a priest and sort of pointed up into the sky. And the juxtaposing photo had the Reverend Timms with the First Anglican Boys Choir. And then another one was in the classroom, Sketches of Indian Life, where Buffalo Boy is sitting there with a book that's sort of dated in the sense of the good Indian, the bad Indian, and then the schoolroom, first Siksika schoolroom, and it was the Reverend Timms in there. So I'd had a relationship with the Reverend Timms already, if you look at it. And then it was about 20, so a lot of my work was looking at the architectural fragments of that school. My mother worked in that school, and during our big renovation, I'm probably a closet hoarder, decided to go into the dump where they were throwing all this stuff and take the lights and take the beds and take a few things and store them at home. This is before I became an artist. And so it was interesting that when the time came, that all that material culture seemed relevant to installations, and part of my own journey of not only looking at that history, but healing, because I too went to residential day school. So it was this continuum of trauma that I was examining and looking at through these objects, in a way exorcising these material from the college. And so I would, so when I started to So I guess by saying all this work was part of my sort of already portfolio of work that I had already done. And then it was in about 2015, I believe, AA, if I'm remembering correctly, when Candace Hopkins connected us. And it was actually really very interesting for me because it not only expanded on the work that I was already doing, but it, of course, posed that question: when somebody apologized, do we accept the apology? And so part of that for me was an undertaking that I had to do with my First Nation. I am one person out of 7,500 and some people on Siksika. And so our protocols is that we bring it to our chief and council and seek their direction in how we should move forward with this. So AA and I spent a lot of time online, sort of introducing ourselves. And I have to admit, even though I knew who General Idea was in the Canadian art history canon, I really didn't know the players. So for me, it was like a new discovery and going, oh, okay, this is kind of interesting. And then also the other aspects of this that I thought, that were interesting connection is both that AA and I are queer, two-spirited. We have this familial history. I have to kind of laugh. I was looking at this the other day and just thinking, okay, there might be other weird connections here. Like my name is Adrian Allen, so AA. And then Stimson, if you dissect Stimson, in it is Tim's son. So it's like this sort of weird thing. So AA, we might be related. Just kidding. It's so interesting. I've been started thinking about this. So what we did is I kind of looked at myself as like being a scout in the sense of just sort of, AA coming to us with the apology, and that I actually first approached or sort of got all the information and sort of saying, okay, is this genuine? What's going on here? And then from that, also consulting with my elders who work with me quite closely on a number of projects. At the same time, coincidentally, CBC in Canada here was doing a pilot called In the Making. And so they were going to be coming and shooting or filming me in my studio. But this particular story was pretty poignant. And so we decided to include that as part of that documentary in terms of the research and et cetera, and the process. So we had, AA, we invited him to the nation, and I sort of turned into my alter ego Buffalo Boy, and we had a dinner. And the dinner was Buffalo Boys, guess who's coming to dinner? And so at that dinner table was AA, Ben Miller, people from the crew of In the Making, as well as the elders, Myrna Youngman, Gregory Big Eye, Letitia Red Crow, Romeo Crowchief, myself, and others. And so, often dinner tables are the places of conversations. And it was at that dinner table that we asked those hard questions about apologies and what do they mean and should we accept them? And it was a wonderful opportunity to share our stories. And it was at that table where AA first, or in terms of the process with the elders, talked about it in terms of genocide. And I think it was a very important gathering. And it was from that gathering that we continued on the work, because AA was formulating the apology. And then through the elders, it was now my situation to approach Chief and Council and say, this gentleman is wanting to apologize to us. And it was interesting because, as I've mentioned before, that we don't get too many people coming to the nation to apologize for historical wrongdoings. Of course, we have the national apology that was made a number of years ago by the government. But it's always this question of that once an apology is made, did you actually walk the talk? And so Pat was part of the process of sort of working with AA. And he, if you look at his history, he walks the talk. You know, he's an activist. He's done so much work that brought attention to a number of political issues. So for me and my process in determining this, I decided at that point to go to Chief and Council and seek their blessing to not only respond to the apology, but inform them that the apology would take place in Toronto, and that we would have to sort of move from that and how do we bring it to the nation, etc. So they gave their blessing and moved forward, and the elders and I went to Toronto, and that's where AA gave the apology. And actually twice. It was, we did the first one and then we did the next one, given sort of the nature of biennials and audiences. But it wasn't, if you look at this, not meant as a spectacle. It was meant at a moment in time where two desperate sort of histories come together, and we look at this idea of conciliation. And so for us and the elders who AA brought to Toronto, listened to the apology, very emotional and very important. And then we, in turn, brought that back to the nation, and Chief and Council again sort of indicated that, you know, there's always another step in these processes. And seeing that I initiated this, it's my responsibility to host or sponsor a round dance. And it would be at that round dance, and it was hopefully we're aiming for this past spring, but of course with COVID, it changed everything. So it was at that time we were to invite AA back, and we would at one of our nation's gathering do a round dance. AA would give the apology at that time to the people, and then from there a celebration. And I think for many nation members, including myself, the apology that we first heard going on a year ago now really meant a lot. And meant a lot in the sense that, you know, it's a lot closer than sort of this nebulous idea of apologies on behalf of everyone to everyone. This is more together, or meaning more personal. And so I think that's one of the things that's so important about these processes, is that the importance of bringing it to the individual. What is your relationship? What is your history with all this? And so this was a real opportunity for us to examine that, move through it, and heal as a part of it. And I certainly know from the elders who were involved and myself, there was a shift. You know, when you look at the tenets of forgiveness, it's, you know, this deliberate decision, a conscious decision to sort of examine those historical feelings and to release those feelings of, you know, of resentment, of vengeance, and all that sort of stuff. So for myself, and I know for the elders, there was that sense of movement through that, and an actual a good feeling, and sort of moving to that place of forgiveness. And I know it's a much bigger sort of history and such, but I think that reconciliation, or I like to say conciliation, begins with individuals, you and I. And that's how I think it needs to begin, because we need to recreate ideas of trust, because that's where it begins. You know, we have to trust each other, and then through that, move to a better place. So for me, it's been a wonderful journey that's not over. And I look at AA now through these screens, and I feel I can call him friend. And as a friend, we will move forward.
And I think what you just said, Adrian, is so important to the idea of an apology. It's that both sides are participants, and they're, you know, there's this sort of openness and a sort of willingness to move forward together that is necessary, I think, in this sort of situation. It's very different than perhaps an apology given by the government, you know, just as a formal legality, which has happened as well. But I think this is something where it's actually building towards a future together that's more personal. I think the other thing that really strikes me about your apology, and I'm wondering if you can speak to it, is that when I read it, has this sense of an invocation. I think you actually call it an invocation at times. So it's not just for those who are living, but it's also for the dead. And I think that in some ways, the spiritual underpinnings of your apology are also what give it some of its power. And I think spirituality in this project is so key, because part of what the residential schools were supposed to do was deprive the Indigenous populations of their spiritual underpinnings, of their spiritual culture. So I think bringing that back and bringing it to bear in such in a place that's so much at the forefront of your project makes it really powerful, and it's connected to your capacity and history as a healer. I'm wondering, I know that's a large question or it's a large entry point, but maybe you could speak a bit to that.
Yeah, well, the text itself, which is this book, and the book was the book was available free of charge at the Toronto Biennial. We printed like 12,000 of them or something. The idea was to make it as accessible as possible. But it comes out of several, several sources that I've used over the years. And the most recent is probably the book of Galatians from the Bible. And it's a book, one of Paul's books, and it's a letter to Galatians. Having given up Christianity for so many years, at the age of 60, I decided that Christianity was the one religion I really knew very little about. And I went to seminary to kind of, in a way, I felt there was something unfinished, and I had to step into my family footsteps and see what was there. So what came out of it, in part, was this form, this literary form of the letter to Galatians. And it's very similar. It's very similar. It is a kind of invocation, and the invocation form is used in many cultures, including, the indigenous cultures of North America, also in Tibetan Buddhism, and so on and so forth. And so it's a form that draws its power from the fact that we find it in so many different spiritual practices. There's a particular, I'm not going to remember the name now, but there's a particular practice in Tibetan Buddhism, a form of meditation, where you take upon yourself the suffering of others, of specific others, possibly, And so I wanted this text, in a way, to be an act of taking upon myself the suffering of that particular community of people in 1894, who were, surrounded by death and dying, their children dying, and they rose up. So that moment of intense suffering, I wanted to try and capture in this text, and I hope I have. It's a very hard text to write, and it's a very hard text to read. So ask me another question, or ask another question.
Well, so I guess my next question is, I know that you consider this an ongoing project. It's sort of a never-ending project, and I think those are, of course, in some of the best projects, the projects that we can never complete, right? The ones that sustain us and that drive us, and that we're not necessarily heading towards a finite ending point. We don't know what that ending point is, but I do wonder what you had hoped to accomplish as you set out on this apology, and if that's shifted over time. Now that you're at the stage where you are now, what's driving you forward, what you think you are moving towards right now.
Well, I wondered the same thing myself. I really have no idea, and at every step, I've felt it's more like feeling quite driven to do it, but not really knowing where it's going. It's of course exactly the wrong thing to be doing as an artist, because there's no product to sell. So it's kind of suicidal, but uh, yeah, I don't have a goal, and I don't know. I know that the next step has to be to go to the nation and to deliver the apology to the Siksika people themselves, not in the context of an art event as we think of it in the so-called art world, but in a, it's more like plunging into a deeper culture that I don't know very much about in order to do it. And I'm terrified, to tell you the truth. Terrified, but looking forward to it at the same time with all my being. And then I feel like that's going to become something, but I don't know what. There's some other. That's just like a first step, but I don't know what I mean exactly by saying that. There's something bigger beyond that, I believe.
I think, the first meeting with kind of members of the nation at that dinner, the Look Who's Coming to Dinner, was that, I assume that is kind of what created the foundation for your project for the Toronto Biennial. I think we can kind of look at the physical manifestation of this project so far. So, in so many ways, this is a social project, and it's not so much about the art installation, but I think, there are ways we can look at the way it has been communicated to the public thus far, and Adrian's project is a really good example of how that has happened. So Adrian, do you want to talk us through this installation that you did?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. It was interesting, how do you respond to an apology? And of course, we're artists, and coming at it from an artist perspective, which is visual, be it painting, installation, etc. So for me, I thought that it would be best to sort of recreate the dinner table or the tenets of the dinner table that evening. So Ini Sukumapi, which is Buffalo Boy, guess who's coming to dinner? We decided to look at a few images from a historical one. So I actually had the table built by a residential school survivor of Old Sun, Gordon Littlelight, and he's a local carpenter. So I asked him if he'd be willing to do this, and he said yes. So I had him build the table itself, a very simple table. The light, of course, comes from Old Sun Residential School, which hangs over the table. And the sort of the essence of when you take a look at the history, in particular, the students and the feeding of students, or the lack of, and the experimentations that took there that are now being well documented. The dining room is often, a center or a metaphor for many things, and also a metaphor for the coming together of people to break bread and to have discussions. So the table for me was very poignant, and appointing it with fine silver and such. And then I decided to create a little bronze bison because I do a lot of work around bison as well, and the historical slaughter of the bison, which is very analogous in relation to the people, in particular the Blackfoot and Plains tribes. And so I put the mini bison there on the plate, sort of looking back at the diner, sort of interrogating them in a way, and then the bowl of white roses with a red rose in the middle. In the back is the painting or drawing called Clearing the Table. It's a charcoal and graphite work that was based on the girls' dining room at Old Sun Residential School. And so I finished that work. But then the petroglyph, the steel petroglyph, I also looked and found the petroglyph that relates to Reverend Tim's short robes, the first Anglican missionaries to the nation. And so I did 3 steel petroglyphs of Old Sun Natasapi, Old Sun Burns Down, and Short Robes, which was the Reverend Tim's. So they sort of sit in the room itself. But then the final work that was up on the wall was a number of school portraits, including my father.
If we move forward in the slides, there's an image of that. There you go. You can kind of see some of it on the back. Yeah.
Yeah, in the background. So I took all those images and sort of lined them up as you would in sort of a school sort of photographic display. But looking at all those faces, I actually had an archive of those images previously. And then I started looking through them, and it was very poignant for me because I started to realize that all these boys were actually our fathers on the nation, and a number of them have passed, including my father, and yet there are many who are still alive. So for me, it was this sense of looking back. Not only you look at them, they look at you. And so for me, it was that sort of that sense of realizing that you know, these are human beings that were in these schools, and this particular work sort of talked to the numbers and also the intimate nature that, you know, I am related to the majority of these people, and the trauma and the history is embedded within these images. So it was a very sort of wonderful opportunity, not only to sort of research and get this information and interpret it into an artist response. So again, creating and looking at that history, exercising that history, creating objects that speak to where we are now, but where do we want to move into the future?
Mm-hmm. Adrian, there's a question for you that's just come in from Jen Miller in the audience, who's asking, how do you process the emotion of an event such as the piece at the Toronto Biennial? And what was the response of the First Nations people to the installation, particularly the photographs?
Of course, it's very emotional, and that's a very personal process. I was so lucky to have the elders' presence there, and together we talk about it a lot. And that's part of this, the importance of these kind of things, is that not only do we talk to each other, but we talk with each other in particular. And so in terms of processing it, so there was a great outpouring. There's a lot of crying because that's a human response to trauma. And so for us, and also through the tears, there's that sense of I don't know, it's a weird sort of, I think anybody who's gone through sort of something very traumatic, there's a lot of tears and anger and such, but through at the end of it, there's a sense of levity. And so I think there was that sense of levity that came towards the end of it. And it's still ongoing, you know, because, you know, the apology is, but it also opens up other things that we're dealing with. I just recently put in my day school claim and had to relive and rethink of all the things that had occurred to me in residential schools. And of course, anger came up, but at the same time, knowing that as one elder said about AA, that she actually felt somebody was listening, that there actually was somebody listening for a change, that, you know, there wasn't this sense of this, you know, us talking and it going nowhere. So that was, I guess, the process. Indigenous viewers, the responses I've received have been overwhelmingly positive, in the sense that the emotion or the emotions that it triggered for them were ones that they were all too familiar with, but at the same time, sort of seeing it visually and sort of looking at it, but also understanding that it comes from my perspective and the Siksika perspective. It is very personal that way. I think the images themselves are always hard to image. It's hard for me to look at those images of all the boys and not feel the sadness and the trauma. But let's not forget too that many of these individuals led lives that I'm familiar with as well, and many of them did very wonderful things in their lives. So that also is the opposite, or I guess part of that sort of feeling. So I think that you know, there's also good, you know, questions about, you know, having these kind of things in the public realm. You know, is it? I've often heard the term trauma porn. You know, is it like, are we just putting this out there for people to be re-traumatized and all that sort of stuff? And I think about that, you know, sort of critique-wise, and I think they're very valid questions, and they're important ones. But I think also at the same time, it's also a personal journey. And in sharing that personal journey, as all of us artists do, we bare our souls for everybody to critique. And so it's like one of those things that I think is important. But at the same time, also remembering that this is not only a personal journey, but a journey of my nations. And hopefully through this process, we'll learn. And it's about knowledge and coming to know ways that maybe we haven't imagined yet.
I'm wondering if there are projects that you did in the past that you feel like in some ways prepared you for this apology project, if there are things that you're connecting to. I mean, you have a long history of both performative projects, but also projects that are tapping into healing and also into activism. And I'm wondering what the connections are that you found most valuable for yourself as you've been approaching this very large project.
Well, I guess the project that's easiest to connect it to, I guess, is this series of projects called Invocation of the Queer Spirits. And those involved, they were performances with no audience and no documentation. So there's no record kept of the performances. But in each case, they took place in a city usually, which had a history of hidden queer populations, so what I would call queer, marginalized populations. And the first one was in Banff, not far out from Calgary, actually, was where it started. And Banff is a funny place because it was not inhabited by the native peoples because it was considered too intensely spiritual. So did something just happen here with our screen?
I don't know, mine shifted a little bit. It looks like you guys are both still here, so I think we're good.
Okay. It set me off a bit.
So you're talking about Banff.
I was talking about Banff. So Banff was a place where nobody lived until the white men came. And there's a history of the trappers and explorers, which were all male communities. There was the history of when the railways were being built through the mountains, again, all male communities. Then there was the development of the tourism trade, especially in Banff, with two enormous Banff Springs Hotel and Chateau Lake Louise. And the original hotels were run almost completely by men, built and then run by young men, mostly good-looking young men from Quebec, were the staff of the hotels. And again, we have an all-male population that's kind of supporting what begins to develop there as a white people's place, as a destination. And there are other communities hidden there too. And so in the performance that I held, we invited those populations, those dead populations, to join us in the room as we, and a kind of conversation started up amongst the people who were there. And it's a strange thing that happens, is this kind of very animated conversation that feels it's not like speaking in tongues, but it's very directed. It's very almost aggressive. It just happens. And then at a certain point, it begins to slow down, and then it's over. Somehow we know it's over, and then the performance is over. So I did that in Winnipeg. I did it on Governor's Island outside New York City. We did it in New Orleans just after Katrina, and different places with very different histories. Actually, New Orleans is interesting because one of the histories that particularly interested me was the community of pirate ships, which stayed, which were more or less permanently in the harbor outside of New Orleans, I think for close to 200 years. Another all-male community. These strange communities that you can't really put your finger on what's going on, you know. So that project has a direct bearing in particular to that format of the invocation, and also of inviting the dead, because in the apology I invite the dead from 1894 to join us in the room. So it can be powerful.
Yeah, and I think this idea of performance, and especially within the realm of art, but as something that is also a healing event, is incredibly interesting to me, and that the healing comes in some ways by connecting with the past, and with those who are not here, and with things that you have lost in one way or another, or that have been lost. And I'm interested in this in relation to your practice as well, Adrian, thinking of Buffalo Boy and this sort of alter ego, this persona that you inhabit in order to connect in some ways with things that have been lost, primary being the buffalo, right, that were so important to sustaining the Siksika Nation. And so I don't know if you want to speak to that at all. And also the idea of performing for as something that is, maybe perhaps just like process-based art that is not so bound up with viewers, right? But is a performance as being an event on its own that doesn't need people to see it in order to have power, I think is an interesting idea.
Yeah, for sure. When I think of the, healing in itself, healing takes a lot of work. And, it's like the process of the apology. It's like, you have to walk the talk, as I said earlier. So that is work, and it's ongoing work. And I think when I look at Buffalo Boy and, the original sort of examination of Buffalo Bill and his Wild West shows, but sort of couched into that was the identity issues of the creation of the Indian quotation marks, the shaman, etc. So you take a look at all those personas, and really it's meant to expose that history and start talking back to it. But certainly I'm not the only one talking back to it. And when I think about it, that there are many artists who within their work have started and do address these issues, and they're ongoing. Because when you take a look at the work that you have to put into it, it ends up being a lifelong journey. And that's why I think when they look at AA and I, that we're saying this is ongoing, not necessarily with expectation, because, it just unfolds the way it's supposed to unfold, as, many elders tell me. They just said, just let it unfold the way it's going to unfold and not have expectations of how it's going to be. And so when I think about that, and I think about the work that it takes, I really wonder, when it comes to these sort of national apologies and such, if the vast majority of people will actually undertake the work. Have any of them read the Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the murder and missing stuff? There are so many recommendations in there for people, what people can do. And so I think that, and a lot of good work has been done around that. So I think that, not only my personas and not only my artwork address a lot of this historical trauma, but also address resilience. And, we have experienced this, we've moved through it, and we continue to move on and forward, and create lives that we're meant to create. And so for me, I think art has been something in many ways that has helped me in coming to a place of solace, a place of grace in many ways, and looking at starting to sort of move through and on. It's going to be interesting to see. Already I'm noticing a shift in my work in relation to these. I'm perhaps, trauma will always be a part of it, but I also sort of looking into this idea of hope, because I've also been called the one who is hopeless. And I say that kind of jokingly, because a lot of the work I do really delves into those desperate histories. And yet at the same time, I'm here, we're here. The Blackfoot people are certainly still here, and we have a lot to contribute, and we do on a regular basis. We're a gifting society in many ways. And I was asking Elder about how did we apologize in the old days? And they basically told me that usually it's usually a gift, that you offer tobacco or you offer sweetgrass, or at sometimes you would bring a horse and such. So AA, you got to bring me a horse. And just kidding. And so, you think about these things. And so in the sense, it's really a journey. still a journey in coming to know and coming to understand our relationships together.
We do have a question from Marie Littman in the audience that I think is pertinent to what you were just saying. She's asking if you have any books or movies you could recommend to help people understand what has happened to your ancestors. And I think one thing that comes to mind for me is that there is this Truth and Reconciliation report that has been very laboriously drawn up and by the Canadian government, I believe. Maybe you can speak to that a bit. But I'm assuming that there are other things that you have both found to be profoundly useful, both in helping understand the past, but also maybe in moving forward. So maybe there are other artists who are also working on in a similar way or with similar things in mind that you might want to speak about as well.
Absolutely. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, that's RCAP. That's the process that took place, and out of there came a number of recommendations, and actually sort of chronicles the history, and then the work around murdered and missing Indigenous women as well. There are a lot of very important information in that, and a lot of people did a great work on that. In terms of movies, nothing at the moment comes off the top of my head. I think there's probably a lot of examples that sort of delve into the history. For the Blackfoot in particular, I don't think there's too much out there. Again, it was one of those moments with the work that Ben Miller and AA did on this project and the research. One of the chief and counsel at the time told me they were really happy to see this document because there was more unearthed, there was more dug up, and a lot of this stuff really helps us in our current time to address issues of land claims, to address legal issues, ongoing issues. So the more research we do, the better. But really, there's still very little information. Other artists, Blackfoot artists, Faye Heavyshield, Terrence Houle, Amaya Telfeathers are all doing this work. Amaya's doing amazing work right now, film-wise, in chronicling not only her Blackfoot history, but her Sami history. So I think that's ongoing. So I think you're going to see a lot more work from contemporary artists. And we do share amongst each other. Trevor Soloway is a filmmaker here on Siksika Nation. The Bear Hat Girls. So there's just so many people who are looking at these in their own way and exorcising this history, but also looking to the future of of who we are and what we will be in the future.
Thanks. AA, it looks like we have back up on our screen now your book. So this is the books. They were actually included in the installation at the Toronto Biennial. They were free. People could walk away with them. It's the Book of the Public Apology to Siksika Nation. So it includes the entire apology, but it also includes all of Ben Miller's kind of archival research into the history of what happened. And so I think this is also a good starting point. I believe that this has just been reissued, so people could look for this book as well. Is there anything else, that you would direct people towards in terms of thinking through these issues that we've been talking about today?
Well, I would just think it's too bad Ben Miller isn't sitting here with us, because I'm sure he'd have a long list of books he could recommend. maybe he would just type, if he's watching, he could type them in on the Q&A. I could pretend they're my own idea.
At the end is recommended readings.
Right.
Oh, so, yes, at the end of the book.
So,
yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, there's a lot in here.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Betty Bastine. I forgot Blackfoot Ways of Knowing. So there's a lot through the elders. So there's a lot of books, a lot of literature out there these days.
Yeah.
And we do have another question from the audience from Adam Pollock about whether or not any First Nations peoples from the United States have reached out to either of you about this project.
Not to me, I don't think.
I've had.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I've had Indigenous artist friends speak to me from the States about it. Just more generally, I think out of interests and sort of curiosity in terms of the process. And I would imagine that there are various groups in the United States who have their own sort of process going on.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously we have our own horrific legacy to deal with here as well. And so I do want to thank both of you for, this exceptional work that you're doing. I think we're living in incredibly polarizing times, and seeing an example of people who are trying to work through a traumatic legacy that dates back generations together to try to build a better future is it's hopeful. You were talking about hope earlier and how it's so easy to despair, to feel like there's just no way to kind of reach across this history and find a way forward. So I am very thankful to both of you for giving us some hope. And thank you for joining us here today. I don't know if there's anything you want to say in closing. It looks like we have some comments coming up in our Q&A, thanking you for everything that you're doing. But yeah.
Thank
well,
you.
if I'll just sort of say that if there's a will, there's a way. And I think that's the most important thing, is that you have to take the first steps in doing this. And I've been really fortunate and pleased and every other thing to have met AA and to build our relationship. And in building that relationship, we can look to the future and hopefully imagine that future in many different ways.
I can't say it any better than that. Thank you so much, Betsy, for all your kind words and good questions.
Thank you.
Thank you both for joining us. And we're looking forward to seeing what comes in the years to come as you continue this.
Me too.
Yeah.
Me too.
And thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us. We're doing these talks quite regularly these days, so please tune in. I know we have some good ones coming up, and you can find them on our website.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Right. Goodbye. Thank you. Take care, AA.
Take care.